Hey, is quiet time even possible when you're a mother? Welcome. It's another look into the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot, who called us to live to a higher standard each day and not be satisfied with just a little empty religion in our lives. As our series continues in the coming weeks, we'll hear from Elizabeth's family, her friends, and others who were influenced by her life and message. Thanks for joining us today. So what can we expect? Well, we wrap up our short 5-part series on questions on mothering. As Shelley Russell has been Elizabeth's guest, we'll think about quiet time and children. And we'll, speaking of motherhood, hear from Elizabeth's daughter, Valerie, as she talks about going back to the Jim Elliot house years ago. And we'll also be thinking about being a good mother-in-law in our second Gateway to Joy program. Son-in-law Walt joins Valerie later on to think about the sad, stinking self. Stay with us for that. First, though, Part 5 on questions on mothering. Hey, as you get advice on mothering, have you kept in mind the need to seek the Lord's will, not just the opinions of your friends? Hear about Valerie's quiet time and her family's quiet hour, about expectations of our children, and about sitting in church rather than being with kids their own age when it comes to our children. Well, let's get to that conclusion on questions on mothering. Shelley Russell along with Elizabeth Elliot. This is called Quiet Time and Children.
This is your friend, Elizabeth Elliot, talking today with my friend, Shelley Russell. Our last time together, Shelley, talking about children. Where shall we start?
Last night, my husband and I were driving home from a friend's, and we are just so perplexed with some of the things our daughter does, and we have been discussing them with a lot of people and getting a lot of different opinions, and it just dawned on me that I really need to seek the Lord, and I need to seek His direction, and I need to spend time on my knees. And if that takes an hour of my day or however long, then it's worth it, that the Lord will guide me and that He knows my child the best and that He will lead me and direct me. One thing that you told me about was your daughter Valerie, and that she has a quiet time with her children each day. And it totally amazed me that you had said that her 2-year-old and her 4-year-old actually sat on the couch for an hour.
Yes, quiet time, we need to define this. Valerie has her own private quiet time with the Lord whenever she can fit it in. She usually tries to do it early in the morning whenever she can, but she has what she calls a quiet hour in the afternoon. And this was instituted as soon as her children reached the age where they didn't need an afternoon nap any longer. So when they had, of course, gotten the habit of taking a nap after lunch, it wasn't difficult to say when they didn't want to go to sleep anymore, but this will be quiet time in your room alone. And it was a very natural transition from a nap to a quiet time. And they realized that this was a time when there could be no television, no noisy games, no talking. They had to be by themselves playing quietly. They could read, they could color, they could look at books, or they could sleep if they wanted to. The principle was children need solitude. They need to learn to amuse themselves. They need to be alone. A little child sitting alone in the corner of a playground on a swing may be doing something much more important than joining in a game of dodgeball with a circle full of noisy children. I think that's overlooked in public schools and daycare centers. Children are constantly herded and directed by adults. I don't think it's a good thing. I think the direction by adults should be, it's time for you to play by yourself. Now, Valerie, now that she has 7 children, she doesn't have a bedroom for each child. Several children share bedrooms, of course. So this means that they cannot be completely alone in the room, but they do have to be totally quiet. There is no conversation. How does she do it? It's not that she's beating him over the head. She doesn't go around checking. She doesn't need to, because this was started when they were 2 years old, when they gave up the nap. And as I have probably told before on this program, there was one occasion when I had some ironing to do in Valerie's house, and that afternoon she had told the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old that they were to sit on the sofa. She put them at opposite ends of the sofa, and she put the timer on the coffee table in front of them, giving them 1 hour. And she said, "This is quiet time." That's all she had to say. Well, they weren't readers, but they each sat with a book and quietly turned the pages for 1 whole hour. Now, the timer is the lifesaver for Valerie, because Valerie goes upstairs and takes a nap. And she doesn't have 6 children coming in during her nap and waking her up every 3.5 minutes and saying, "Mommy, is it time? Is it time yet? Can I get up? I don't know what to do. What shall I do now?" No, it's understood. It's a rule. And it is amazing how it works. One time, all 6 of them were staying in our house, and my husband, who had never grown up with small children and never had small children of his own, he was a little bit amazed at the noise and the doors slamming and the going up and down stairs and kids in and out and just constant motion in the house all day long, until suddenly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon everything was quiet. And he said to me, "Where did the kids go?" And I said, "It's quiet time. They haven't gone anywhere." He couldn't believe it. The house just suddenly became quiet. It's a habit.
And I'm seeing, too, that it depends on your expectations of your children. Also, I'm wondering, you've mentioned many times that children should be able to sit in church at a young age. And what is the benefit of sitting in church with adults rather than going to children's church?
For one thing, they need to be with different age groups. They need to be with their parents more than they need to be with anybody else. This is one of Valerie's main reasons for homeschooling, and I don't want to get off on that subject now, but children really don't benefit by being with peer groups before they're 8 or 10 years old, because they're much more likely to absorb the values of the peer group. When Valerie experimented by putting her little boy in the nursery in church, it took her about 3 weeks to realize that he was coming home with very bad habits. He was being disrespectful, and he was destroying toys, and she thought, why is he behaving this way? And suddenly she realized that he had learned it in the church nursery. So she just decided no more church nursery for a child who's beyond the infant stage. And since then, her children have always sat in the church. They probably don't absorb a whole lot even when they're in junior church, because, again, it's a case of adults talking down to children and herding them together. And I certainly wouldn't rule out the possibility that they're learning something, but they may be learning something more important by sitting in adult church. And just the habit of sitting still and being respectful is important.
When you want to teach your children spiritual principles in the home, many families have the devotion time for children. And I was wondering how you think we should go about doing that. Should we sit down and read the Bible and then talk to our children, or there's a wide variety of children's materials out there for specific age groups?
I'm not bashing all the materials that are out there and the flannel graphs and all sorts of colorful, interesting helps for children, but I am a strong believer in the old hymns and the Bible itself. Now, my father, he was very compassionate in not expecting us to go through a long process in our family prayers. Family prayers were very brief. I don't think I ever timed them. I'm sure I never timed them, but probably lasted 7 or 8 minutes at the most. It was after breakfast every morning. But we did sing a hymn, and I think it's extremely important for families to learn to sing together. And we went straight through a hymn book. Then my father read from Hurlbut's story of the Bible. He wasn't reading the King James Version in the morning. We did read King James Version at night after dinner, so we heard both. But Hurlbut's Story of the Bible is another one of those good Bibles that's just written in simple language, and it has pictures in it. And the reason that he read that was because there was a span of 16 years between the oldest and the youngest in our family, so there was always a little child. And he would read maybe one page of that without commentary. We didn't have a Bible lesson. We didn't have a quiz. He occasionally might ask a question just to see if a child was paying any attention at all. And it's amazing to me how much children absorb when they don't seem to be paying attention. And then he prayed briefly. We knelt, and he prayed the Lord's Prayer together. But that's all, and that was a strict routine, very simple and brief. As Amy Carmichael said, you can't keep a rubber band stretched to full length all the time. Be merciful to your children. Don't expect them to sit through a long family devotions. And for fathers who are timid about leading family devotions because they don't think they're very spiritual, all you need to do is open the Bible. Just read a little bit. Read a story from the Bible.
Elizabeth, you mentioned earlier about reading the Bible to your child before they go to bed, and it's funny, but I've never thought about actually reading the Bible. There's so many materials out there to read and so many children's books, and I just felt very encouraged to read those, and nobody really encouraging me to actually read the Bible to my 1-year-old daughter.
Well, let me give you a very practical suggestion. Start with the 23rd Psalm and read it every night for a week. And when Julia starts to talk, she is going to be able to say the words of the 23rd Psalm without you going through some kind of a routine of repeating it over and over again at the same time. We learned thousands of verses only because the Bible was read to us out loud in church, in Sunday school, and at home. And God commanded the people of Israel to speak of these things when you sit in your house, when you talk with your children, when you walk with your children by the way, when you stand up and when you lie down. These are the principles that you speak to them. And I was just reading my mother's little article about training children. She said that just by simply reading the 23rd Psalm every night for 1 week, her little son Jim, my youngest brother, who was probably 2 years old, had it memorized. Children have a miraculous power of memory. So whatever other books you use the Bible too. Well, my guest has been Shelley Russell, mother of 1-year-old Julia, and I hope that the questions that Shelley has asked me are questions that many of you have been thinking about, and I trust that you will have found some help in the answers. The Lord bless you.
The wrap-up to our short 5-part series, Questions on Mothering, that was Quiet Time and Children. Well, speaking of mothering, we hear from Valerie Elliott Shepard, Elizabeth's daughter, as she talks about going back years ago to the Jim Elliott house.
My mother and her husband invited my husband and me to go to Ecuador and meet in Quito. We were actually celebrating the 40th anniversary of the death of, I don't know if you say celebrating, it was a memorial service at the HCJB radio station. And we met Steve Saint there, who is Marge Saint's son, Nate Saint's son. And our son, Walter, was actually living with my Uncle Bert, who is my father's older brother, who's now in heaven also. And Uncle Bert had been a missionary in Peru for many years at that time. And by the time he died, I believe it had been 63 years of work in Peru. And so our son, Walter, came to see us when he was in Peru. It was an unbelievable way that God allowed him to get on a bus for 36 hours, cross the border between Peru and Ecuador, which is always chancy. You never know what's going to happen at the borders. He got to meet us right at the airport in Quito, and he got to be with us as we went to visit the Quichuas, as well as going to visit the Waorani. It was a wonderful trip, and a very unusual thing happened. I think I still have a few more minutes to say this. We were visiting the Quichua Indians in the house that my dad built. Some Quichuas had decided it had been empty all these years, they might as well move in. And it unfortunately had broken up any harmony that was in the tribe of Quichuas in that little village called Shandia. One family felt it was their right to move into the house. The other family said, well, we helped build it. We helped Mr. Jim Jaime Elliott built it too, so we should be able to move in. So there was a huge rift between those two families. And so when we got to Shandia, it was very sad to see that the Quichuas it was all about who was living in my father's house. And so we go up to the house, and of course everything's overgrown. Nothing looks quite the same. The house, a little dilapidated. But we sit down to sit with the Quichuas. And of course, my mother could still speak Quichua. And they brought us boiled eggs and chicha, that manioc drink that I mentioned. And so my mother, Lars, my husband, my son, Walter, our oldest, we're all sitting there eating, when a blonde, leather-clad young man walks through the jungle to the house. And my mother said to him in Spanish, thinking he might be Spanish, he actually asked first. He said, "Is this the house of Jim Elliott?" And he asked that in Spanish, and my mother answered him in Spanish. And he was just overcome because my mother said, "And I happen to be Jim Elliott's wife, and this is our daughter, and this is her husband, and this is their son." And he just said, "Well, I read through Gates of Splendor while I was in Germany, and I decided to go visit Ecuador and thought I might start learning Spanish and do some mission work in Ecuador. And I thought I'd come see Jim Elliott's house, and it just happened that we were there on that very day." So my mother was thrilled that somebody was coming to see it. And we just had a nice visit, of course, because she could still speak Quechua. She explained that to the Quechua Indians, and she could still speak Spanish. So that was a huge gift from the Lord that day.
Valerie Elliott Shepard, daughter of Elizabeth. Well, our second and final Gateway to Joy program for today is Being a Good Mother-in-Law. And it's appropriate that we hear from Walt and Valerie Shepard, Walt being the son-in-law of Elizabeth Elliott, and they'll talk about the sad, stinking self. First, though, being a good mother-in-law. What is the secret to that? And would you say that it's a privilege, if you are a mother-in-law, of being so? What are some of the rules that Elizabeth has? Maybe you've heard some good mother-in-law jokes. What's the key to being a good one, a good mother-in-law? Could it be that mother-in-laws too often think of that son or daughter-in-law as still being a child?
I'm acutely aware of the fact that I'm not an expert at this, but it's about a privilege that I have and many of you have, being a mother-in-law. I have a set of rules here for myself, which I hope might be of some help to some of the rest of you. I listen to talk shows every now and then because I want to know what people are listening to in order to have some idea of why what I'm saying sounds so crazy to so many people. And on many of these talk shows, we hear couples talking about their marital problems. And one of the primary marital problems is mothers-in-law. Now, what's wrong with us? I don't know all the things that are wrong with us, but maybe these rules that I've made for myself will point up some of the areas of weakness and help us to remember what a privilege it is to be a mother-in-law. So first of all, I would say thank God for this acquired son or daughter. As they always say at the weddings, don't think of this as losing a daughter, but as gaining a son, or as losing a son, but as gaining a daughter. So I have been given the privilege of being the mother-in-law of a man who happens to be named Walter D. Shepard, Jr., and Walt Shepard is a gift from God to me. He's the one who makes me a mother-in-law, because he wanted my daughter. So I thank God for that. I certainly thank God for marriage, for the fact that he gave to my daughter a husband. And I had prayed all her life that the Lord would give to her a godly husband. Those of you who have small children, it's hard for you to even imagine being a mother-in-law at this point, but I would recommend that you start praying right now for your future son-in-law or daughter-in-law, and pray that that person will be prepared for your son or daughter in God's way and in God's time. A second rule, remember this man is an adult
with adult responsibility. The fact that he is your daughter's peer sometimes makes us forget that he's not a child. We sometimes forget that our adult children are not children anymore. And so unconsciously we begin to treat this person as a child because we treat our child as a child. Remember that this person is an adult. This man or this woman given to your son or to your daughter is an adult with adult responsibility, which means that he is capable of making his own decisions. Allow him to do that. Third rule, remember that your son or daughter now belongs to this daughter-in-law or son-in-law. Your child is claimed by somebody else. Walt has a special claim on Valerie, such as I have never had. Valerie was lent to me by God as a gift, and in the wedding I gave her to Walt. Her father was not living at the time, so my brother Tom led her up the aisle and technically gave her to Walt, but I was standing there in the aisle relinquishing her in my heart to this man. So try to remember that your son or daughter now belongs to somebody else, not to you. The scripture says that a man is to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Leaving and cleaving are not always easily accomplished, and you can stand as a very big obstacle to your son's leaving you and cleaving to his wife if you continue to claim him. So just remember, your son or daughter does not belong to you anymore. Your son-in-law or your daughter-in-law has a special claim on that person. Number 4, when you give something, you've got to let go of it. Let go of your daughter and your son-in-law. And there's this peculiar sense, an unusual sense, in which I had to let go of my son-in-law too, because, as some of you have heard, my son-in-law actually was a lodger in my house for 2 years before he married my daughter. He was a seminary student, and he had come to help me take care of my second husband, who was dying of cancer, and it was in that way that he met my daughter Valerie. So I sort of looked upon Walt as a son long before he became my son-in-law. I always look on the lodgers that we have in our house as people for whom I have a certain degree of spiritual responsibility. My husband Lars and I have had students living with us for all the years that we've been married. In fact, I had students before that. So now I think we're up to about number 24 or 25 students who live in our house. And Walt was in that position. He was like a son to me, so I had to let go of both of them. Number 5, expect your son-in-law to be different. He comes from a different family. They have different ways of doing things. He will be very different from your daughter. Don't be surprised about that. Isn't it ridiculous of us how we get so shocked to find out that people do things differently? When we get married, it is a shock to discover that very simple things that we've always done in exactly the same way can be done in a different way. When is a towel dirty, for example? Maybe your son's wife thinks that a towel is dirty if it's been used once. Maybe your son was not used to having a clean towel every day. This may come as a shock to his wife and to him. Number 6, let your daughter do things his way, or any way other than yours, if she wants to. You've got to let go of her, too. So when you visit their home and see that things are not done exactly the way you did them in your home, let them be. Number 7, do not dish out gratuitous advice. And here I am on this program dishing out gratuitous advice, but of course you can tune me out real fast. And I've said on this program before, and I'll say it again, never pass up an opportunity to keep your mouth shut. When you're just about to dish out gratuitous advice, there's an opportunity to keep your mouth shut. It's a wonderful thing if your in-laws come to you for advice, and I actually have that kind of a son-in-law for which I'm very grateful. He will ask me advice on this or that, and my daughter still asks me advice continually. And I'm sure that I have dished out a lot of free advice that they did not appreciate, but they're both very kind, and they have never made me feel that I had intruded into their lives. But it's very easy for us to do this unconsciously. It just suddenly comes out. Well, why don't you do this, or why do you do it that way? The 8th thing, pray for your son or daughter-in-law. There will be things in them that you will probably feel critical about. You know that old song, "You can talk about me just as much as you please, I'll talk about you down on my knees." Undoubtedly, your son-in-law and daughter talk about their mother-in-law and their father-in-law. Rather than criticize him to other people or criticize him to his face, do your praying first. Be sure to pray for that in-law. Number 9, never criticize him to your daughter. She knows his weaknesses better than you do. She knows strengths that you probably haven't noticed. Keep your mouth shut when it comes to criticizing your son-in-law to your daughter. And the last thing, be an encourager in every way you can think of. Ask God to show you ways to encourage them that you haven't thought of. Be an encourager in every way you can think of. One of the things that I try to do to encourage my son-in-law, since he is a pastor, is to copy out bits of spiritual wisdom that I find here and there onto 3x5 cards. I put a title at the top with the hope that that may help him in filing them so that they are retrievable. Files aren't much good if you can't retrieve the information that's in them. But that's just one of the little things that I try to do to encourage him. Sometimes I come across subjects that I think might make great sermon material. I don't know whether he files them or not, but that's one way that I do try to encourage him. And I've asked him if they're useful, or would he prefer that I just not bother him with all those little slips of paper and 3x5 cards. And he said, no, by all means, they are useful. Continue to send them. So I do that. I try to encourage him as I see him in his father role. He is really a wonderful father to my grandchildren. And I try to tell him so. Be an encourager to your daughter in every way that you can think of as well. Is she doing a good job as a wife? Tell her now. Is he doing a good job as a husband? Tell them. But try not to do it in such a way as to make them feel as though you are scrutinizing everything they do. So I'll run over these real fast again. 10 things for mothers-in-law. Thank God for that person. Number 2, remember he is an adult. Number 3, remember that he belongs to your daughter, not to you. Number 4, when you give something, let go of it. Let go of your daughter, let go of your son-in-law. Number 5, expect him to be different. Number 6, let your daughter do things his way. Number 7, don't dish out advice. Number 8, pray for them. Number 9, don't criticize to your daughter. Don't criticize your son-in-law to your daughter. Number 10, be an encourager in every way you can think of.
That's called being a good mother-in-law. And appropriately enough, Walt and Valerie Shepard, Walt being the son-in-law of Elizabeth, Walt and Valerie in 2022 visited St. Philip's Church, and they talked a bit about the sad, stinking self.
I love the one that says, "Deliver me from my sad, sweet, stinking self."
You can say who that's from.
I have no idea.
Okay. When my mother was at Prairie Bible Institute, the president was quite a character, and he preached regularly to the student body. And he one time started a prayer with that, "O Lord, deliver us from our sad, sweet, stinking selves." And my mother caught on her ear, and she quoted it often. But she said it was because Dr. Maxwell heard all these pitiful stories of students wanting to confess their sins but so often it's not something that has to be shared with the whole congregation. And he knew that they were trying to be honest and real and confess their sins, but not all sins have to be confessed openly. But that's why he prayed that way. So my mother loved that phrase.
Val's mom, as my landlady, loved to come up to me because she knew I was studying for the ministry and say, "You know the quote, 'I like a finished preacher'? No, not a polished one, but one who's through." And I go, "Yes, ma'am."
Walt and Valerie Shepard. Well, our time together is just about at an end, but thanks for letting us come into your home. Well, maybe it was your office, or maybe along with you as you took a walk, wherever we found you today. On behalf of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, let me invite you to check out all the resources at elizabethelliot.org. Maybe you want to hear more Gateway to Joy programs, or you want to read devotionals, hear talks, well, other resources too. It's all at elizabethelliot.org. From Apple Podcasts comes this comment. It's from Ash Tim. I think my closest friends have gotten used to the phrase that has constantly left my mouth over the last 6 months. It's, "I know I'm a broken record, but I was listening to Elizabeth Elliot last night while I was doing the dishes, and she said, I have found this podcast priceless. I have long searched for a godly older woman role model to look up to. It's especially helpful when they have left a legacy like hers. I can say confidently I have found that in Elizabeth. I have shared many of these messages, laughed with the stories, cried with the deep truths." Well, thank you for those very kind words, that testimony. And thank you, friend, for coming along with us today. Be sure to join us next time as well. But until next time, may God remind you each and every day, you are loved with an everlasting love. And underneath are those everlasting arms.